the process is completed. So what we are saying is preliminary. The Carter Center observers continue to observe the tabulation process as we speak with teams at the Georgetown Tabulation Center and around the clock, so we like to thank them for their commitment. The center may issue additional reports in the day ahead, and a comprehensive report will be released in the coming weeks. At this juncture, it is especially important, we believe, that political parties and observers accompanied the GECOM processes of tabulation and finalization of the result in order to ensure transparency and that any dispute are addressed through appropriate legal channel. GECOM has made progress in tabulating results so far, but the process may still take some time to complete itself. And only the Guyanese Election Commission has the authority to declare results. As the country awaits that declaration, the Carter Center urges the key political stakeholders, leaders, to act responsibly and in the interest of all Guyanese people, consistent with the spirit of the Code of Conduct that all parties have signed 3 days ago. The Guyanese Election Commission utilizes its strong base of electoral expertise to conduct a well-managed voting day operation. We've been all in the field throughout the day. The voting and counting processes were generally well prepared and logistically sound. Overall, the Carter Center observers reported that voting and counting processes were largely well organized and peaceful, and they assessed the implementation of voting procedures as positive, with only some inequalities. GECOM's polling staff seems well trained on polling procedures, and they exhibited professionalism throughout election day. The Carter Center observers noted, though, that it took a long time to apply counting procedures. The Carter Center observers encountered political party scrutinies in all the stations they observed, which provided an important level of transparency to the voting and counting processes. In 95% of the stations observed, the Carter Center observers assessed the performance of political parties' scrutineers as positive. In some areas, particularly Region 4, the Carter Center observed the presence of campaigning and campaign material within 200 yards limit of polling stations. In addition, observers of the Carter Center noted the presence of information desk operated by the two major political parties in Region 4, 7, 9, and 10, particularly in Georgetown. The Carter Center heard some complaint in Georgetown regarding the presence of the stand within 200 yards of polling station. So these are some observations that we made on election day. I'll pass the floor to my colleague to carry on.
Thank you, Madam Prime Minister. Again, we're honored to have you here as part of our delegation, and I echo the sentiment that the election was well prepared, that the poll workers were very well trained, that they exhibited a remarkable amount of professionalism throughout the day. In addition, I also commend the Guyanese people on their commitment to democracy, on their participation in the election, and on a peaceful conclusion to the day. Also, to echo Madam Prime Minister's point, the process is ongoing. And of course, the tabulation and the reporting of the results is a crucial aspect of this process, and the Carter Center cannot comment now on that process because it's not complete. But we will be here, and we are observing it very carefully. The last thing I'll mention, and then give a few more specific remarks, is that the transparency of the election with respect to the party scrutineers from the major political parties is a good bedrock of transparency on which these elections are built. And that transparency should continue and must continue throughout the tabulation and reporting process to ensure that that level of transparency is maintained. But one of the things that provides a good foundation for the election system is the fact that all over the country, in almost every single place that we've been, that we saw real active involvement from the various political parties, so that the processes have been well scrutinized, not just by international observers, but by the Guyanese people themselves. One issue to address, as many of you know, with respect to the governance of GECOM, the appointment of the GECOM commissioners has been based on a recommendation that was made in 1992 that has been called at sometimes the Carter formula. And in that regard, it was later integrated into the Constitution, as you know, and it gives GECOM a partisan structure that was appropriate at the time of that recommendation. But as many of you know, for the last several elections, the Carter Center has called on the Guyanese people and has suggested a reconsideration of that formula to increase the efficiency of the commission and to avoid the highly polarized gridlock that's possible in the current system. So we would again encourage, as we have before, a rethinking of the manner in which the Election Commission is appointed in this country. And again, that's a question for the Guyanese people and leadership to discuss. In addition, with respect to GECOM, over the course of the election period, the Carter Center has noted that while the election procedures itself have built-in transparency, GECOM's decision-making has at times lacked transparency, and therefore we would also encourage the Election Commission to adopt an external or public relations system that would ensure greater transparency for the decision-making process of GECOM with respect to all of its stakeholders. Another comment with respect to voter registration. This process has been the subject of much debate over the last year or so in Guyana. It became a very complicated endeavor to ensure that both the original registration list and the list that was created, in the midst of the litigation with regard to house were integrated in an effective way. On election day, our observations, and I think those of the other observers, show that this process of reconciling the lists were largely successful. We did not see major problems with respect to the list on election day, and that is important and good. However, as we also know, there's a large increase in the list. There's 660,000 registered voters on the final roll, which seems disproportionate to Guyana's estimated population, and therefore we would recommend for future elections, and we'll give more specific recommendations later, but that the process and the technology used to create and manage those lists get looked at carefully and overhauled with respect to that process. Another issue in the lead up to the elections has been the question of polling stations and the changing and closing of certain polling stations in the days, frankly, right before the election. That pre-election period, while the issue was resolved, it was only resolved days, again, before the election, maybe even Sunday, before the election in some places. And so one of the things we wanted to mention is that some stakeholders have linked this discussion to a recommendation that the Carter Center made after the 2015 elections with respect to private residences. And the Carter Center does believe and continues to believe that voters should have an opportunity to vote in neutral locations that are perceived to be neutral and that are in fact neutral, and that recommendation is important. However, the Carter Center also recognizes that in some areas it may be required to use private buildings or others, and it has not undermined public confidence in the process. at the same time. And no matter what, decisions with respect to the polling stations and their locations need in the future to be made well in advance of the election to avoid confusion and to ensure that the public has a chance to understand exactly where they'll be voting on election day. Given those recommendations, we've provided everyone a very detailed preliminary statement that goes into far greater detail than we just have with respect to our observation of the campaign period. As you know, the Carter Center has been in Guyana not only since 1990, but in this event for several months. And frankly, I was here a year ago personally, and we've had a set of teams that have come to observe each aspect of the process. Some of those preliminary findings are in the report that you have today. We, again, appreciate the opportunity to be here. We are honored as the Carter Center to have been so engaged and so well received by the community here in Guyana. We are honored to have been a part of a group of other international observers that have participated in a very well-observed and transparent process up until now. And with that, we would be happy to take any questions that you may have, but otherwise, we appreciate very much that you all have been here this morning and sharing your time with us. So with that, Soya, we're happy to take questions as you'd like. Sure. Yes, thank you.
Prime Minister and Mr. Carter, 3 questions. You spoke of no major problems on E-Day. Could you say if any complaints came to you about displacements, people who couldn't vote in a particular area? And also, did any of the parties raise with you their opponent distributing identification cards to voters? And sir, what would you say to the 2 major political parties who are at this time declaring a win? And my last question, you have made several recommendations in various reports since 1992. They're all gathering dust. Can you or would you be seeking more concrete commitments from the politicians? Thank you.
Well, I'm going to take your second question about the 2 parties claiming victory. I do believe that everybody should refrain from declaring any results. There is, by the Constitution, a body that is there for that. It is called the Guyanese Election Commissions. By law, that's the only body that by law should be declaring results. So we appeal to both political parties and their leaders to refrain from declaring any result if they want to do justice and support democracy in Guyana. I come from Senegal, where we went through elections several times and we changed president. We had our independence in 1960. We changed 4-time president. And life goes on anyway. So I do believe that it's about exercising responsibility as leaders to make sure that they go by what the law says. The law says clearly that only GECOM can declare result. So they should exercise both responsibility and follow what the law says. I think that's how they would help democracy. That's what is expected from them as leaders. It's a heavy word, leaders. It means that you open the way for the rest of the people. So everybody should live up to that expectation. So only GECOM should be declaring result.
And in addition, to that, there's a procedure for any sort of disputes that might arise with respect to the results. And to the extent that the parties have had an enormous amount of access to the process, that's excellent. There's a statement of polls, and there has been real transparency into the accounting and the tabulation. And so if there's a dispute about the results, there's a legal process that can be carried forward that is provided for by law. So that is the way that we would anticipate this going, and everything that we have seen is that is going to occur. You know, we've seen a number of court cases in the lead up to this election. People have responded on all sides to support the rule of law, and that's certainly what we would expect. With respect to displacements and ID cards, let me address that. Number one of the most important things that we know is that we have heard bits and pieces of reports, snippets from different locations around the country. Even yesterday I was reading about the California election in the United States with long lines and issues in certain polling stations. Those small issues or the displacements of someone being sent to the wrong location, they are incredibly important to that voter. And we need to ensure that that voter has the right to ensure that they can have their voice heard. At the same time, those smaller issues don't affect the broad scope of the conduct of an election. And so we need to be careful that we are not looking at isolated incidences and then trying to draw grand theories with respect to the election. So that's number one. Number two, we did hear a number of complaints on Election Day. We investigated a number of complaints on Election Day, and we know that there are a few issues that were isolated, where people had discussions, or where people showed up and were making accusations, but we haven't seen any of the evidence, and to the extent that there is evidence, it'll be handled through the normal course by the local authorities who are in charge with enforcing the laws in Guyana. But I do know that on a number of occasions, people were reacting to rumors, and when we arrived in several locations where we had heard what was going on, we looked with our own eyes, and we saw that things were very calm, that the issues were more rumor than fact. And so that's another reason why it's important to make sure that we're reacting only to the facts and making sure that, to the extent there are reports of issues out there, we're getting to the bottom of those facts before responding. With respect to the dust gathering on their recommendations, there are a number of recommendations that we have made over time that have been well implemented. And we appreciate two things about our role here. Number one, we are not Guyanese. The Carter Center is an organization that cares deeply about this country, but ultimately the decisions on these issues are for the Guyanese people and for the Guyanese political system. And so it's very important that our recommendations are made from our perspective, but they are taken or not as the leadership of this country may desire. And so it is not our responsibility, and we wouldn't demand anything from those political leaders. We merely make our recommendations. But also I would say that because we've been here for such a long period of time, and because we've been discussing recommendations, as I mentioned, for example, the famous Carter formula from 1992, there are recommendations that make sense in the historical context of the moment. And then as things change, it's going to be very important to change with them, right? And so one of the things, for example, that is important to the Carter Center is after this election, we will be engaged, and we hope that the Guyanese people will engage in a discussion about reform of the constitutional system and the winner-take-all election process and political system that exists in Guyana, because that's one of the ways to reduce national division, to ensure that this country is able to move forward together into this next very important phase of its history. And so, again, that'll be a recommendation that comes from the Carter Center, or a set of assistance that comes, but it's going to be for the people of Guyana and for the leadership in Guyana to take those next steps. So thank you for those questions. Happy to answer more. Yes, in the middle. Blue shirt. You, yes, absolutely. I can repeat the question. Go ahead. Yeah, thank you.
Just one, Drew Brown from TV6 News in Trinidad and Tobago. You did speak about some issues concerning GECOM. The length of time that it is taking to get a final declaration. Understanding the history of elections in Guyana and so on. But in this instance, is the Carter Center concerned that it is taking too long?
Well, one thing we need to all agree upon is that there is no perfect electoral process or system I've been involved in many, many elections, including my own, led twice, 3 times. Presidential campaign, the first time I lost, the second we won. And a system is always improvable. But of course, there is always a give and take between having quick result or making sure that the process is completely transparent and, you know, people accept the results. So it's always sort of a bargain. And I would always go for making sure that all the stakeholders agree with the result, even if it takes a bit of time. That would be my take on that. But more broadly, for a system to work, it required trust. And that's also an appeal that we would make to all the actors, not only the political parties, but also civil society, groups of young people, women, to make sure that they sit around the table and discuss openly how they're going to improve their own system, but their own political system as a whole. It's important that people define themselves as Guyanese first and sit around the table, make concession to each other, so you get to the next step. I like to always bring it back home. In Senegal, it took the party, the ruling party and the opposition to negotiate over the years to improve the system as we go along. And I'm sure that that's the way forward here. So, of course, the Carter Center will look into all the details of the complaints, of the shortcoming, of the flaws. As I said, there is no system without flaws, including in the United States, if you're allowed to say so. So the idea is to how to build commitment from each parties and going beyond even the political parties, which is also an important point. They are not the only actors when it comes to politics and deciding the future of a country. You do have young people who have their voice to come in. Women, civil society, unions. And I hope that after this election, when people accept the result declared by GECOM, there will be life going on and dialogue will be fostered by the actors themselves. We are external, no matter how committed, you know, the NGOs, the international NGOs, or the UN, or the different, you know, embassies would be. It is up to the Guyanese first to sit down and accept to discuss the way forward. I think it's important to see it that way.
And with respect to the length of time that it's taking, our faith is based on the transparency. And so to the extent that the transparency is maintained, to the extent that all the political parties have access to the process, to the extent that the rules are being followed, you know, the process can run its course. And I do believe that from what I've seen, the people who want the process over the fastest are the ones that are doing the counting, right? I mean, these folks have been up for days. There's a lot of tired people out there, but we, you know, as long as we maintain that transparency, then, you know, we want to streamline the process, but I don't think anybody has a concern so long as that transparency is maintained. Sure, then we'll give someone else a chance.
In Trinidad and Tobago, there are online posts that since yesterday congratulating the PPPC as having won. It continues to happen. Your call for responsibility here in Guyana, does that also extend to, let's say, those interests or parties or any other persons outside of Guyana, such as Trinidad and Tobago?
If anyone has a mechanism for controlling what people say on social media, let me know.
Good morning, Dennis Chabral, Damrar Waves News Talk Radio. Sir, can you confirm whether indeed you and your delegation or part thereof met with the President of Guyana earlier this morning? And do you at all have any idea in your interaction with the GECOM when perhaps the country may be able to hear a final declaration?
I'll say this, and then I'll ask Madam Prime Minister also to comment. We in fact met with President Granger and with his senior staff and his campaign team this morning. We also met yesterday with the leader of the opposition and with the presidential candidate, Mr. Ali. And so we have been engaging with those stakeholders. We have been discussing their thoughts on the election and the reports and the extent to which they have had access to the process. And both sides have told us that they have had transparency, they have had access to the polling places, to the counting process. And while there have been some concerns expressed, we're continuing to hear from them and to work with them going forward. With respect to the timing, again, that's for GECOM. And so, and one of the things that is clear, even from the news today, is that the expectations of when something's going to be completed, we all need to be very careful to ensure that we're not making promises on behalf of someone else and on behalf of a process that really requires the kind of transparency and accountability that's out there. So I don't know, but we know that it's ongoing and it's going on in a transparent process.
And a follow-up. Oh, madam, sorry.
Yes, we met both candidates, but not only them. We met with other candidates throughout the days we spent here in Guyana. We met with civil society, we met with young people, which is the usual methodology that we apply in countries where we go for observation. So, but mostly, we convey exactly the message that I shared with you here. Both of them, we told them that we recommend highly that they refrain from announcing results until the Guyanese Election Commission does so. So that was very, very clear as a position of the Carter Center.
Just to follow up, in your interactions with the leadership of the two major political parties, did you at all seek to to encourage them, whichever side the elections may go, to be magnanimous and concede defeat?
Yes, that's exactly what I said. Reframing from announcing result, the next reasonable step, an important step, is to abide by the result declared by GECOM, which is by law the only body that is allowed to do so. Yes, so that was part of the message that we conveyed to them.
And I'll just note again, both parties have, and the group of other parties that we've seen over the last year and beyond have all demonstrated their reliance and faith in the legal system. If there are disputes, if there are questions, we anticipate that they'll be raised through the appropriate channels and that the process will run its course and that both sides will respect the rule of law and the outcome of the election.
My name is Kit Nascimento. I'm a senior member of the Private Sector Commission Observer Team. We know each other, and let me begin by saying thank you for being here. And I am a Guyanese. I'm risen to take the floor because I think this is an appropriate opportunity to point out that our mission is now reliably informed that the count in Region 4 has stopped and that the returning officer is no longer in place. I make this point to make one other point. We ask you and all of the international observer missions to remain in Guyana and to remain engaged until the count is completed and that GECOM declares the final result. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I will let you know that there will we have people at the District 4 account as we speak. We sent another group there to ensure that we could get a full sort of accounting of the process. We know your observers are there. We know that the party observers are there. We know that there are other independent Guyanese domestic observers that are there. So there are a lot of eyes on the process down there at the GECOM Tabulation Center, which includes the District 4 tabulation. So we will be there, and the Carter Center, again, has been in Guyana since 1990, and we are not going to leave now. So.
And we hope that counting will resume very quickly and everything will be completed to the end. So the process remains transparent all the way to the end, to the final results.
We'll take one more question. And then, if there's no more questions, I'm going to go to the tabulation center at District 4. Last question.
Thank you. Tini Husti, Bar Association of Guyana. Just clarification, or whether you have been informed that whether there's been an effort to limit the number of observers at the counting in Region 4.
Yes,
I was instructed to do that.
No, I'm aware of who asks you to speak. My friend, I thank you. So we, I'm not aware of anything like that. I know they've got a big room. I know they've got a glass wall, and I know that there's a lot of people in the room. So we're going to go head down there right now. But to my knowledge, I don't think there's been an effort. I do know that there are rules governing who is an observer. But if you're an accredited observer, it's my understanding that once you have that accreditation, they've been providing access. So we're happy to discuss that in a minute if you want to follow up. But otherwise, we appreciate everyone for being here. We hope that you will take a look at the detailed preliminary assessment, and we thank you very, very much for your support of the Carter Center.
We come cross the Caribbean Sea, mother, father, picnic, and we settle down in GT. Why oh, we bend down on the coastal plain, the hot sun and pouring rain, and we planting the rice and cane. Why oh, yes, we take off the boots and we put down the roots. Why oh, so the crab would that grow in Essequibo